Ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between, it is Debate Sensei NPDA edition, where we talk about things relevant to the National Parliamentary Debate Association for competitive debate. I have with me the Assistant Director of Forensics for San Diego State University, Kyle Pryor-Landman. Thank you, Kyle, for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Okay, so in this episode, we are going to kind of do a deep dive on the final round topic for last year's NPDA National Tournament, the 2024 NPDA National Tournament. And it is, I didn't have it in front of me, but I believe it is the United Nations should intervene in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yep.
Okay. Well, then let's get started. Why don't we start by talking about what did happen, and then we could go into how it might be different a year later or half a year later, and those other things. So, in this final round, do you know what happened, even if it was only like a vague recollection of what happened in the round?
That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I honestly I don't remember exactly what
Okay.
happened during that round. Yeah, I was grading because I begged them to not be on the final panel.
Yeah.
Because I
Okay.
needed a grade.
Right.
But um, I remember the round being very close.
Okay.
If that's any recollection. I know the ballot count was pretty. It was 4-3.
Okay.
So I imagine like the ground is probably pretty good on both sides if it's ending up, a 4-3.
Right. But did they basically reject the topic? I thought that was at least a vague recollection that like the topic itself wasn't the,
I think so.
or did they just straight up policy debate?
I think it was straight up. If I'm
Really?
remembering correctly, I think it might have been straight up.
Well, then that would be a welcome change to a lot of the outrounds that I've been hearing about from NPDA.
Yeah, it
Okay.
certainly would be. I again, I don't remember 100%. I wish I did.
Okay. Well, well, then that will make this all that much more of a pure analysis. We're not going to let any sort of prior arguments taint the way that we look into this particular topic. So let's start with we're on the affirmative. Okay, you just imagine that you've been assigned the affirmative. You're in this round. You've gotten this topic. Where do you start with a topic like this? What are some things that you would advise people to address?
One of the things that I think as the AF that you need to be very careful with United Nations topics is making sure that you can actually solve.
Okay.
Um, and so I think looking at what the United Nations can actually functionally do, um, and also determine right very early on in your prep process, what are we intervening at? Like
Yeah.
what does intervention mean?
Right.
I think that intervention can be a lot of things, and you should probably be preparing several counter interpretations if you're the MG, because I mean, T intervention is probably like the easiest slam dunk here. So I think if you're, the way that my partner and I used to prep, right, the PM would write all the advantages, and the MG would write all the second lines and all the counter interps. Um, and so that would be where I would start. um, make a plan, stick to what we mean by intervene, and make sure that the UN can actually do that.
Okay. Um, so if you're stuck with UN intervention, do you have any types that you typically gravitate towards to help your ground?
I generally gravitate towards peacekeeping.
Okay.
I'm kind of, a hard power hack. And I think that anything to do with the military generally links.
Okay.
And that's kind of where my thought goes with this, right? Is that out like diplomatic intervention isn't probably going to get us anywhere.
Okay.
Um, and I think that like if you did like food aid, you're just going to have a tea debate. So I think that the most clear avenue for this is peacekeeping.
Okay, so I'm even going to do a little prompt. Peace. Are there any? So it starts getting tricky when people start asking, like, all right, so what are some examples of good peacekeeping efforts by the United Nations? Did you ever get asked that? You ever get stuck on that question or that challenge?
And this is why I hate UN topics.
Oh,
I I mean, there's just not really. I mean, I think that, right, it's this kind of very neoliberal idea of what it means. Like, I don't know, does sovereignty even matter anymore?
right,
And I guess my own personal gripes aside with it, I mean, I think that you have to win the framing, right? You're
right.
winning that multilateralism is good. You need to win that peacekeeping and interventionary measures are good. And then even if you're not winning that, you could probably win on like the try or die, right?
Hmm.
That like UN intervention and peacekeeping is probably better than a coup. Um, I mean, maybe that's that. I guess that's probably the argument you're going to have to go for. I mean, I don't want to sound like a UN doomer,
Yeah.
but it's it doesn't really mean anything, right?
You think people like? You think there's a more room to push back against that than people take on? Because I'm doing like a quick search right now, and the one that comes up is like United Nations mission in Liberia. I promise you that I do not have any expertise in this one, but listing some of the accomplishment about like disarming over 100,000 combatants, helping about 1 million refugees. That one seems to come up in at least in the prompts that I'm asking for like the most successful UN interventions. It seems like maybe I don't know. Maybe we just kind of give in too easily against those
Hmm.
challenges. Is that possible?
You know, I think that is definitely a possibility. I mean, I just think, right, the general consensus among the debate community is that the UN is pretty useless as an actor,
Right.
right? But I also don't think that that should necessarily keep you from reading something just because a disad exists,
Right.
right? That doesn't, like, there's a disad for everything, right? Presumption's very powerful,
Hmm.
and I don't think that that should stop you from saying UN intervention good, right? Just
Hmm.
take the neoliberal pill and just say it's good, right? Say it with your chest and say it's good. And like I don't think that there's anything like wrong with that. Um, there's probably something good to be said for UN intervention, right?
Hmm.
Even in the DRC, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that brings us to an issue that we were talking about before we got this started, which is there's another sort of sticking point in this one, a more theoretical level one, which is since the 1960s. It looks like the UN has had a presence, a form of intervention in the DRC, right?
Yeah. Most recently, it was the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or MONUSCO.
Yeah.
Um, and that started in 1999 and is actually like a permanent mission
Okay.
in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's a permanent peacekeeping mission, which makes writing an inherent AF very hard.
Yeah. Okay. So why is that such a problem in debate? Why is this? So inherency is one of those theoretical positions in debate that at least my students usually have the most difficulty with. There is usually very limited amount of literature. It's not a word that people usually tend to use, and even when they do, conceptually, it doesn't always mean the same thing. Why is that a problem?
Yeah, so inherency is essentially the issue, or the stock issue of is there, like, has this already been tried, or is this currently happening, right? Is this the status quo? Um, and the issue comes, right, theoretically, like very meta debate level, is that the AF is supposed to advocate for a change from the status quo, but if the resolution is written in a way that the AF is forced to then either defend the status quo with advantages, then that either takes away all of the negative ground, or the AF can never meet its burden, which is proposing a plan that materially changes the status quo. And as the way this is written, the UN is intervening
Yeah.
currently in the Democratic Republic of Congo, at least with a peacekeeping force.
Right. So,
Um,
man, that might even make it so, like, if your go-to is usually peacekeeping, and you're like, well, I have to do something that's not inherent, so I'm going to do something other than peacekeeping. It might actually be, it's like we have to do some type of intervention that's not happening in order to be topical. It's kind of a squirrely way to do like a different program.
you know, yeah, I think though that you just need to be very careful with what the definition of intervention is, right? You
Right.
can't I mean, you have to be very careful here. Otherwise you are not inherent,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What is your intervention? I mean, and there's already a lot of UN organizations that are on the ground in the DRC, not just a peacekeeping force, but I'm sure, you know, again, if you want to take like a crazy definition of intervention, right? I mean, it could be like any UN action in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Um, I mean, I just don't know how you win that.
Okay. Well, some of the current events happening in, so like another thing that like you always want is to be as current as possible with these issues. And so recently there was a presidential election. I hope I'm saying this right. um Tshisekedi, Felix Tshisekedi, okay, is president. There was an attempted coup. It failed, and now Tshisekedi is asking for MONUSCO to pull out by the end of 2024. That seems like you might be able to spin an inherency argument out of that. Would you?
I mean, yeah,
It's like they're trying to push him out. It's like, no, no, no. We should intervene. It's like, yeah, we are intervening right now, but we should continue to do so.
this feels very much like the 2022 NPDA
Uh-oh.
semifinal round
Okay.
that I ended my career on. But it was Iran rejoining the JCPOA, right,
Okay.
the nuclear agreement. But Iran never left.
Oh, right. It was
um,
U.S. who pulled. Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
yeah, you
Yeah.
know, and so it was always like, I know we read Inherency and lost. We also read a really dumb K. But you know, we we read Inherency, and I mean the answer is right, perceptual, right?
Mhm.
You could avoid the inherency argument by being perceptual.
Mhm.
Um, you know, if the UN is openly defying the will of the elected president of a country, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a pretty big perceptual change.
Right. 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 So let's say that you are able. Let's say that inherency is just not an issue, right? Or that you have a plan for it, or something like that. You still have to have case arguments. What do you think? Some like the staple case arguments need to be on a topic like this.
Um, I mean, I think you run advantage one peacekeeping good,
Okay.
and you basically say that the UN needs to intervene, otherwise more coups are going to happen, right? I think you could make an argument about like coup spillover, right, in the region, right? Like the Sahel had a bunch of coups earlier this year, and that like, you know, regional stability is really important in Central Africa. Um, Peacekeeping stops like armed militias. Peacekeeping stops extrajudicial violence, right? I mean, I think that all of those arguments are like, you know, probably true, and you know, at least enough that you could probably win the impact framing.
Okay.
Um, you know, and then I think advantage two is multilateralism good.
Mm.
And you just kind of make this very vague claim about uh, UN intervention signaling like cooperation among nation states, right? And this like very thinly veiled anti-offensive realism, right? Just that, like, multilateralism solves for a lot of problems in the world, and like it's probably good that we get United States troops and Russian troops on the same peacekeeping force.
Okay. Okay.
And then that way, even if you're losing the inherency bit for the actual intervention in the DRC, you still have some strategic flexibility to go back and win on that hedge argument.
Okay. All right. And like you could do a little bit of time looking into, like, it says that there's like 22 programs that they got in there, and like you might be able to like sort of cherry pick a few of them that are the most impactful. I mean, like I'm looking like demining.
Yeah.
Looks like a good one that you go for. And so
hmm
maybe throwing your opponents for a loop with like a demining advantage on that level. Not bad.
Yeah, I mean, food aid, like violence against women, like interventions for violence against women from the UN,
Mhm.
um, AIDS
You okay?
prevention, yeah,
Okay.
from UN AIDS. Um, I think that like the WHO also like probably net positive to have in a country that like a tropical country, right? That there's like Ebola outbreaks in the DRC, and AIDS is a huge problem for people living in the DRC. So I think that like the WHO falling under the UN, increasing the WHO's intervention might also be a very interesting um, take. However, the topic does not say increase,
Okay. Oh yeah, yeah. Okay. So
right?
like, you could, yeah, you could play with that a little bit. It's like, yeah, there is intervention. There should be continued intervention, right? It's almost like you're forced to defend the status quo, and so now the counter the neg has to. It's almost like they're forced to have a counter plan. Like the burdens are reversed almost.
Yeah, I mean, like it's bad, but like I don't know, maybe this is one of like the very weird times where like I actually might think presumption flips.
Oh
But like that also is a weird thing to have happen at final round at nationals, right? Where it's like,
yeah,
I mean, I just think that the final round should be an example of really high level good debate, and instead it's like we're having to dance around stock issues. I don't
right.
know, I mean, again, that's maybe just a high theoretical level
Yeah, yeah,
complaint, but it's just a little weird. It's a
yeah.
really tough app. You have to be very creative to make an app that sticks here.
Okay, so let's say that you're on the now. Let's change hats. All right, we're on the neg now, and you
I'm
want to,
thrilled.
yeah. And let's. How do you formulate this inherency argument into a voter? Like, how do you frame that? Like, what does that sound like?
So the way we've done it in the past, we kind of just read it as like a very like top of case argument, right? Where you're just like, hey, this right here's all of the reasons why the UN is currently intervening, and this is why it makes it impossible for us to debate this round.
Okay.
Because the affirmative is not meeting one of the stock issues, which means that like they don't meet the criteria to have a debatable round.
Mm,
Um, right? Because the negative is essentially having to write disadvantages to the status quo, which is what an advantage is, which means that the burdens are flipped, and now no one can engage in this debate in a way that's like constructive. Um, it eliminates clash, right? It makes it impossible for the negative to generate offense. Um, I mean, I think there's
yeah.
a million reasons why like not reading an inherent AF is a bad thing for the negative.
So, like responses from that on the affirmative. Do people still say things along the lines like, "Well, that's not our fault. I mean, we're doing the best we can with the topic that was given to us."
I mean, I think that is the answer.
Okay.
But also you can make the perceptual argument, right? And I think that,
Mhm.
when we did our final debate of my career, that was the answer to it, right?
Yeah.
Was that one, we have to do what the resolution says, otherwise you're forcing us to be untopical, which is worse.
Mhm.
And also, we perceptually rejoin,
Okay.
right? We perceptually intervene, right? We do some sort of perception thing, and that makes it inherent because the perception right now is that they're not.
All right. Um, you were talking a bit about how food aid or diplomacy might run into some topicality uh, problems.
Hmm.
What might those problems sound like? Why would those things be topicality issues?
Well, I think if you Google
Mhm.
the definition of intervention, let's see, the action or process of intervening or interference by a country in another's affairs.
Mhm.
Um, Food aid isn't really interfering in an affair.
Got it. Got it. Is the
Right,
government being like, yeah, sure, feed our population? That's great.
right.
Okay.
And I don't think that that would necessarily be like interpreted as an intervention or a disruption or some sort of material change, right? That like the government wouldn't like, right? Intervention, I think, implies some sort of like um against your will, right? And I think that might be something important to include in the definition if you're running topicality. Um, but there's like, I mean, I think if you, as the negative, pick a very narrow definition of intervention and just say intervention means UN peacekeeping, or
Okay.
or intervention means the sending peacekeeping forces, um, and then sure,
Yeah.
I
Yeah. If they don't, especially if the affirmative doesn't even offer some sort of definition, right?
yeah, and I mean, I'm very pro reading T regardless.
Mhm.
I mean, unless it like they define it as what we thought they were going to define it as. But if it's like different, then like sure, go for it. I think that this is a really good round to do that in because it says is intervention, um, and not significant, not increase, not decrease, not substantial, right? It's
Yeah.
just intervention.
Right.
Um, so
Something that like would predictably be opposed by whoever's in charge,
yeah.
right? Like that would be intervention because if you're just engaging with them, there's certain levels of engagement that would be welcome engagement, right? But
Hmm.
there shouldn't be any such thing as welcomed intervention as far as like the DRC's government would be concerned.
Well, no,
Kyle?
I think of like that show where they like do interventions for people and like
Oh,
they
oh,
have to like surprise them.
got it. Yeah,
It's like no one ever wants to be intervened
yeah,
on,
yeah.
um, let alone sovereign nations.
Okay, that's a
You
fun
know,
little metaphor to use. I love
yeah.
that. Excellent. Okay, so that's a topicality position. Um, it, you're going to run that, or you're going to prepare it regardless, not necessarily run it regardless. But
Hmm.
what would you think would be a disadvantage that you should get to run on the negative as long as they're topical?
I mean, I think you could just do a blanket UN bad disad.
Okay.
Um, I think just saying like the UN isn't solving anything. The UN like and or the UN is generally like net worse in those situations, right? Like putting peacekeepers on the ground is like causes some sort of alternative harm that it doesn't exist. Like if that wasn't the inherent problem, right? And that's where the rating dissats gets really hard, because like they're already intervening, um, and so it's like, but you'd have to make the argument that like the intervention itself causes bad things to happen. Like peacekeepers are, like do bad things
Oh yeah. Okay. Okay.
sometimes,
Okay.
right? Peacekeepers are a net drain on a country's and already struggling country's resources. Um, they have to feed, clothe, and shelter them, and they can't just mail all of that in.
But there's also like certain limits on what they could do. It's like you're sending people in with guns, and then there's like these pretty strict restrictions on how they use them, where they're allowed to go.
Yeah,
And so it's like it almost seems like security theater, right?
right.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I also think that this would be a pretty good round to run like a security K
Okay.
in, or like a Gombin or, um, you know, some sort of critique of neoliberalism. Um, which would probably be where my mind is going, just from the way I think.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, I think you could also just do a critical disadvantage and not run an entire K,
Okay.
and just say that like multilateralism is bad, or like like intervening in these countries is bad, and here's like all the philosophical reasons, and here's like why that type of intervention like necessarily leads to fascism.
Right, right. And like the examples of UN failures are actually even more unique when you're talking about the Congo, because like the number one and two examples usually are like Rwanda and Somalia. Yeah,
Hmm.
like that's usually, I don't know, that's what I go for. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And while that's in the west, of the continent, the Congo, is like, I think, regionally close enough that those two examples would be a lot. I don't know. It links way harder than if you're talking about UN intervention in like the Ukraine conflict right now, or if there's some sort of East Asian one. Even though you could still make that argument, but
Yeah.
um, yeah.
I mean, the Srebrenica massacre in
Mhm.
Yugoslavia, right? I mean, that was spurred by UN peacekeepers firing back on military people.
Yeah, right.
I think that there's a lot of reasons why, like, you put random people from like a group of countries all armed into some conflict that they ostensibly have nothing to do with.
Right.
um and then what are the ramifications if they kill somebody? What are
Right.
the ramifications if they have to actually peacekeep and not just stand there and project
Mhm.
force?
Right.
um you know what does that mean for the country when other countries are coming in and killing their people? And I think those are all very valid theoretical, not theoretical in the debate sense, but like
Yeah.
theoretical objections to UN intervention.
Right. It, especially in Congo with the history of colonialism,
Hmm.
like you'd be able. It's not hard to like tell a story about how that presence would easily be portrayed as another attempt at colonialism to the
Hmm.
people in there, and like regardless of whether or not it is or not, even if it is not colonialism, it would be easy to portray it that way, right? And
Yeah,
it might actually be colonialist.
the neo-colonialism argument, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
that there's so much there, and I think that like extractive colonialism, right, where they, the Belgians just sent in the military and extracted everything from the DRC,
Hmm.
is, or I guess, what was now the DRC, um, is, it's very similar. Like, come in and protect the mines, and come in and protect all the resource
Okay.
extractions, right?
Got it.
And that's like the UN's not coming in to save the people; they're coming in to save the infrastructure, right?
Uh-huh.
Because we need the cobalt and we need the lithium to make our batteries for our Teslas, right?
Right. um so let's get on to the last sort of tool on the negatives disposal: counterplans.
Mm.
Are there counterplans that you tend to go for? Are there some generic ones that you might recommend?
Um, Again, because it's me, I always would just swap it with the US,
Oh
and
wow,
then
really?
read a hedge advantage,
Ah.
um, or a hedge net benefit, or a hedge disad.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that was generally like kind of what we would do on UN topics, is just say, no, actually the US should do it, because the US is already pretty much doing it through the UN, so we might as well just have the US do it and make our hedge look better. Um, Again, I don't think that's for everybody. I
Interesting.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think that most teams want to say that. Um, I think that you could do like the African Union.
Okay. Like
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Like their record also seems a little spotty on that, huh?
yeah. But at least like you can probably skirt around more of those like Western colonialism arguments, right? Or like coloniality coming from the global North, um, right? And say that like, Africa is helping, Africans are helping Africans, and it's not like Western powers coming in to like keep the resource extraction turning. Um, what else could we do? I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be all actor counterplans either. Um, I mean, I think.
Yeah. I mean, like consult, but like you're consulting the president of the Congo, or like time delay seems weak. I don't know. Let me take a look. What are some AU success stories? Well, let me see what if we could find any several success. I guess there was a 2007 program in Somalia. So like, and that almost becomes like the counterpart. So Somalia and Sudan are counterparts as far as the AU, but both of those seem to be a little iffy on those ones.
Something else could be interesting is China.
Oh yeah, right. China has invested a lot in the entire continent, and so like being that sort of agent. Oh man, I wonder what a China hedge argument would sound like. It's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I think Belt and Road good, right? That like
Yeah.
this coup could destabilize Chinese relationships with the DRC, um, and that Chinese investments key to like regional stability, and Chinese intervention is like a clear show that the Chinese are willing to take force to protect their investments.
Huh.
And that probably like solves back for regional stability if they're afraid of the Chinese coming in and just taking out their investments
Right.
militarily.
Yeah.
Then I think that could be a very interesting debate, right? Is the UN
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
China?
So a lot of it seems like the alternate agent approach yields a lot of opportunities, more so than some of the standard other generic counterplans that you might go for.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is a tough situation, especially considering that the most people I know of don't really have a background in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It would be like whatever you can glean from 20, 30 minutes of prep, and so it becomes tough. But thank you for kind of like doing some mental gymnastics through this really difficult topic with me. Look forward to speaking about some in the future.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Kyle.
Thanks, Jared.
All right.